3 weeks before he died, Grigori Rasputin sat down and wrote his own death letter. In it, he predicted the exact way he would be murdered. He predicted who would do it, and he predicted that if those people killed him, the entire Russian royal family, the Tsar, the Tsarina, all 4 of their daughters, their only son, would be dead within 2 years. He was right, almost to the day. This is the story of a Siberian peasant who was stabbed, poisoned, shot 4 times, and thrown through a hole in the ice, and somehow still got the last word. Some people called him a saint. Some called him the devil in a monk's robe. But almost everyone who ever stood in the same room as him agreed on one thing: he was very, very hard to get rid of. This is the story of the man they couldn't kill, or more accurately, the story of the man who made an entire empire believe that. Part 1: The boy who wasn't supposed to matter. Grigori Rasputin was born in 1869 in a tiny village buried deep in the frozen middle of Siberia, about as far from a royal palace as a person could get. His family were peasants, no money, no education, no path to anywhere. But even as a child, the other villagers whispered that there was something off about Grigori. Some said he could sense things before they happened. Others swore he healed a dying horse just by resting his hand on it. Whether any of it was true barely mattered. What mattered was that the reputation stuck, and Rasputin never once tried to shake it off. As a young man, he married and had children, and for a while it looked like he'd live out the same short, quiet life as everyone else in that village. But then he did something strange. He left. He walked away from his own family to wander the Russian countryside as a religious pilgrim, drifting between monasteries, preaching to strangers, building a reputation as a starets, a wandering holy man with a supposed direct line to God. Russia had plenty of those. Therefore, Rasputin needed something the others didn't have, and he found it. He had an almost unnerving talent for making powerful people feel like they needed him specifically. By the early 1900s, that talent had walked him straight into St. Petersburg, the beating heart of the Russian Empire, and a city that should have swallowed a barefoot Siberian peasant without a trace. Part 2: The secret that let him in. A wandering mystic showing up in the capital should have gone nowhere. Russian high society was one of the most rigid, bloodline-obsessed cultures on Earth. But the royal family was hiding something. Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, had one son, Alexei, heir to the entire Russian throne, and Alexei had hemophilia. His blood didn't clot properly. A small bruise could quietly turn into internal bleeding that wouldn't stop for days. A minor stumble could kill him. Europe's best doctors had nothing that actually worked. Therefore, when a mysterious healer from Siberia was introduced to the royal couple in 1905, claiming he could ease the boy's suffering, Alexandra didn't just politely listen, she grabbed on with both hands. In 1907, Rasputin was called in during one of Alexei's crises, and somehow the bleeding slowed. Then, in the summer of 1912, came the moment that sealed everything. After a jolting carriage ride, Alexei developed a horrific hemorrhage in his leg and groin. He swelled up, spiked a fever, and slipped into a delirium so severe that doctors quietly told the family to prepare for a funeral. In desperation, Alexandra sent Rasputin a telegram begging him to pray. 2 days later, against every medical expectation, Alexei began to recover. To this day, historians argue about what actually happened in that room. One theory has nothing to do with mysticism at all. It's that Rasputin simply insisted the doctors stop giving Alexei aspirin, a drug that thins the blood and would have made a hemophiliac's bleeding catastrophically worse. Remove the aspirin, and the miracle makes a lot more sense. But Alexandra didn't see pharmacology. She saw proof that God himself had sent this man to save her son. And from that point forward, Rasputin wasn't just a healer to her, he was untouchable. Part 3: The peasant who ran an empire. That single belief, that one filthy, wandering stranger held the life of Russia's future czar in his hands, turned Rasputin into one of the most powerful people in the country. He was pulled into the innermost circle of the royal family. He began weighing in on political appointments. He was rumored to keep a private list of society women he'd seduced. Stories of drunken parties, orgies, and whispers that he was secretly the Tsarina's lover spread throughout St. Petersburg like a fever. The Russian aristocracy watched a barely literate peasant whisper into the ear of the Empress herself, and they despised him for it. But the more they despised him, the tighter Alexandra held on. And the tighter she held on, the more untouchable he seemed to become. Untouchable, that is, until the summer of 1914, the first time someone actually tried. Part 4. The first time they tried to kill him. Her name was Kionia Guseva, a former prostitute turned devoted follower of one of Rasputin's fiercest religious rivals, a monk who publicly branded him a fraud and a heretic. On a summer afternoon back in Rasputin's home village, Guseva walked up to him on the street, pulled a knife from beneath her clothes, and drove it into his stomach. As he staggered backward bleeding, she screamed that she had killed the Antichrist. There was no elite hospital nearby, no royal surgeons, just a village doctor and a man bleeding out on a dirt road in the middle of Siberia, and somehow Rasputin survived. That same month, still recovering in bed from the stab wound, Rasputin sent a frantic telegram to the Tsar begging him not to drag Russia into the war building in Europe. He warned that war would bring the end of everything, Russia, the monarchy, all of it. Nicholas reportedly tore the telegram to pieces without acting on it. Weeks later, Russia entered the First World War anyway. Rasputin's first prophecy had just gone completely ignored. It would not be his last. But for now, the story that spread through Russia wasn't about a warning nobody listened to. It was about a man who'd taken a blade straight to the gut in the middle of nowhere and simply walked away from it. It was the first appearance of what would become his signature. Rasputin gets hurt. Rasputin doesn't die. Part 5. The most hated man in Russia. With Nicholas away commanding troops at the front for most of the war, Alexandra leaned on Rasputin more than ever, letting him weigh in on cabinet appointments and government decisions he had no business anywhere near. Ministers were hired and fired seemingly on his word. To ordinary Russians, freezing and starving through a war that was going badly, it looked like their empire was being run out of one peasant's back pocket. Propaganda posters mocked him, newspapers hunted for scandal, and a small circle of aristocrats became convinced that as long as Rasputin was alive, Russia didn't stand a chance. They decided he had to disappear. What none of them realized was that Rasputin had already told the Tsar exactly what would happen if they succeeded. Part 6. The letter that predicted his own murder. In early December 1916, weeks before his death, Rasputin sat down and wrote what he believed might be his final message. He told the royal family plainly that he sensed he wouldn't live to see the new year, and then he laid out two very different futures. If he were killed by ordinary people, simple peasants like himself, the Tsar had nothing to fear and the Romanov dynasty would rule for generations to come. But if he were murdered by nobles, by men related to the Tsar's own bloodline, the outcome would be catastrophic. He warned that none of the Tsar's own children would survive more than 2 years, that the nobility responsible would flee the country in disgrace, that Russia itself would be torn apart from within. Alexandra reportedly took the warning seriously enough that it haunted her in the weeks that followed. Nicholas, by most accounts, dismissed it as the anxious rambling of an old man under threat. Therefore, life at the palace carried on, and 3 weeks later, a group of nobles walked Rasputin into a basement. Part 7. The night everything went wrong. The plot was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy young aristocrat married into the extended royal family, alongside Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas's own first cousin, and a hardline nationalist politician named Vladimir Purishkevich. On the night of December 16, 1916, Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace on the Moika Canal under a flimsy pretext, the chance to finally meet his strikingly beautiful young wife, Princess Irina. Rasputin, who by nearly every account had a serious weakness for aristocratic women, took the bait without a second thought. He was led down into a private basement room laid out with wine and small cakes. According to Yusupov's own retelling, those cakes and that wine were laced with cyanide. Rasputin ate, Rasputin drank, and according to Yusupov, absolutely nothing happened. He just kept talking, kept drinking, and at one point casually asked Yusupov to play him something on the guitar. Upstairs, the other conspirators waited to hear that it was finally over. But 2 hours crawled by, and Rasputin was still very much alive, still sipping his wine like a man with nowhere else to be. Here's the detail most retellings conveniently leave out. Later research into the plot suggests the poison may never have actually made it into that basement at all. The man responsible for supplying the cyanide reportedly had a last-second change of heart and quietly swapped it out for crushed aspirin instead. If that's true, Rasputin wasn't surviving a lethal dose of poison that night. He was surviving no poison whatsoever. There was no miracle happening in that basement. There was just one frightened conspirator who lost his nerve at the last minute. Part 8. 4 bullets and a river. Whatever the real explanation, the poison clearly wasn't working fast enough for Yusupov's liking. Therefore, he panicked, grabbed a pistol from his writing desk, went back downstairs, and shot Rasputin in the chest at close range. Rasputin dropped to the floor. Believing it was finally over, the conspirators left him lying there and went back upstairs to plan their next move. But sometime later, Yusupov returned to check the body, and Rasputin's eyes reportedly snapped open. According to Yusupov's account, Rasputin lunged up, grabbed him by the throat, and somehow hauled himself back up the stairs and out into the courtyard, crawling toward the gates in a desperate bid to escape into the night. It's the single detail that built this entire legend. A man shot straight through the chest, climbing back to his feet to run for his life. Purishkevich, waiting outside, opened fire as Rasputin staggered across the snow, finally bringing him down with a shot to the neck. Then, to make absolutely certain, one of the men walked up and fired one final round directly into his forehead at point-blank range, what the conspirators themselves would later call the control shot. His body was bound, driven to a smaller branch of the Neva River, and dropped through a hole cut into the ice. Part 9. The autopsy that ruined the legend, and that's where the legend was born. The unkillable peasant, poisoned, shot 4 times, and finally drowned. It's the version that's been repeated in books, films, and documentaries for over a century. There's just one problem. The autopsy performed on Rasputin's recovered body found no water in his lungs, which means whatever else happened to him that night, he almost certainly did not drown. He was already dead before his body ever touched the icy current of the Neva. So where did the myth of the man who wouldn't die actually come from? Mostly from a single unreliable narrator, Felix Yusupov himself. The vivid, almost cinematic account of poison that failed and a corpse that clawed its way back to life comes primarily from 2 memoirs Yusupov published after fleeing Russia, first in 1927 and again in 1952, by which point he'd lost his entire fortune in the revolution and badly needed money. A story about single-handedly battling a demon who refused to die sold a great deal more books than the truth. 3 panicked, wealthy men shooting an unarmed dinner guest in a basement. Part 10. What actually made him hard to kill. That's not to say there was nothing remarkable about the man. He genuinely did survive a knife straight to the stomach 2 years earlier with none of the medical resources available in the capital. He genuinely was a massive man for his era. Well over 6 feet tall, built from decades of hard Siberian peasant labor. It's entirely plausible that between his raw physical size, a flood of adrenaline, and an almost fanatical religious conviction that he was personally protected by God, Rasputin endured trauma that would have finished off a smaller, less stubborn man far sooner than it finished him. But the version where he casually shrugs off cyanide and rises from the dead to fight his way out of a locked basement, that part belongs to Yusupov's typewriter, not to Rasputin's body. Part 11. The prophecy comes due. Here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Remember that letter, the one written 3 weeks before his death, warning that if nobles killed him, the Tsar's entire family would be dead within 2 years? Rasputin was murdered on December 30th, 1916 by a group of nobles, exactly as he described. Barely 2 months later, revolution tore through the streets of Petrograd. Within 3 months, Nicholas had abdicated the throne entirely. And on the night of July 16, 1918, 1 year and roughly 7 months after Rasputin's body was pulled from the Neva, Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children were led into a basement of their own in the city of Yekaterinburg and shot to death. Well within the 2 years Rasputin had predicted. The aristocrats who killed him believed they were saving the monarchy. Instead, none of them were ever formally punished for the murder, a detail that only confirmed to ordinary Russians just how untouchable the nobility truly was, and just how broken the entire system protecting them had become. Yusupov and Dmitry Pavlovich fled the country in disgrace, exactly as the letter said they would. Russia itself spent the next several decades torn apart by revolution, civil war, and famine, exactly as the letter said it would. They killed the man they blamed for dragging Russia toward collapse. Russia collapsed anyway, and the man they killed had already told them it would.